is the IONIQ 5. It's an all-wheel drive, fully capable, fully electric vehicle. It gets somewhere around 250 to 300 mile range depending on the model and trim levels. It is efficient, it's very quick, and this is not your average IONIQ 5. We've done a couple things to it. We've done a few things that I think will make it just a little bit more capable in mud or snow or sand, and certainly in the urban environment, help you manage potholes and parking blocks, for example. So a brief overview of the project before we get into the details. I've changed out the tires and wheels, as you can see, lifted the car about 2 inches, installed a roof basket and a spare tire, and we'll come around the back. Also installed a tow hitch and a tow link as well for recovery. This can also be used, of course, for towing a boat or a small boat or a small trailer, as well as maybe a bike rack, for example. I also changed the mats on the car. These are the all-weather mats from, which actually were sourced from Germany, but they're a Hyundai product. You can see them in the back as well. This is one piece. Just remember, if you order this interior floor mat from Hyundai, just make sure you get the one that's appropriate for your trim level. You can see that this piece comes out if the console slides. This includes the back, the trunk space, put a full rubber liner in there as well. If you are thinking about doing a little bit of even light off-road, of course, some basic recovery equipment is important. Traction plates, I think these are important for sand and mud. Can also help you lift it with a jack. Of course, a jack is essential. A well-rated rope or nylon cable, a shovel, not a bad idea. In fact, a requirement in certain areas if you're going to go into the deep sand. Probably don't need a hatchet. Not sure why that's there, but so let's start with the wheels and tires a little bit. This car came stock with 19-inch wheels. It also, the higher trim levels also have the option of a 20-inch rim. So the first thing I did was, to give us a little bit more rubber, was to reduce the wheel size by an inch. So these are 18-inch rims. These are, I got these from Touren via Fitment Industries, and they are a little bit lighter than the stock rims, but not by much. They are about 8 inches wide. That compares to about 7.5 for the stock configuration. And the offset of these are a little bit more. So the offset for the stock rims are plus 49, and the stock, the offset for the Tourens are plus 40. And what that means is that as you get higher on the offset, you get closer to the interior of the car. So the lower the offset is, get closer to zero, it pushes out a bit. That's not very much. That's only about 2/3 of an inch or so, or about 2/3 of an inch out, but it gives it a little bit wider stance. You could go even more aggressive if you had a plus 30, for example. That would come out even another ½ inch. But I think this is good. This sets us out a little bit wider stance. And then, of course, the tires. Probably the most important element if you're going to do a little bit of off-roading, or I should say overlanding. It doesn't have to be super aggressive. These are sort of all-terrain, road and off-road capable, so you can drive it on the highway as well, but they have a little bit more grip to them. It will help you in the snow and sand or mud a little bit. And so the stock tires for this car were 235, 55, and of course are 19. The other higher trim models come stock with a 255 wide tire, so a little bit bigger, and of course a 20-inch rim. So I wanted to go just a little bit bigger. I was kind of chicken to go too big until we changed things a bit. Now that we have the car lifted, I think it can accommodate even more. But I went with a slightly bigger tire size, somewhat conservative. These are 245 60s R18, and that translates into about a quarter of an inch taller, and overall diameter about a half an inch wider diameter. That's pretty minimal actually. But these are, these are reasonably sized tires to begin with for this car, so I didn't want to get too aggressive. They're Falken Wild Peaks. You could use, for example, the Nitto Nomad Grapplers or BF Goodrich Train Terrail TAs. I looked at the Toyo Open Country AT3s, as well as Goodyear Wrangler all-terrain you could even consider. Now that the car is lifted, you might even be able to consider being more aggressive still, something like a 255 60 R18. That's a 30-inch diameter, as opposed to the stock, which is 29, and then the current tires right now, which are about almost 30, or 29 and a half. So let's talk about the lift. The stock configuration on the IONIQ 5 is a mere 6.1 to 6.3 inch ground clearance. That's certainly not acceptable for off-roading capabilities at all. You really want something a little bit more respectable. So I was looking for at least a minimum of 2-inch lift, and I'll send another video about how we did this in particular, and maybe even some instructions. But in brief, I've tried a couple different configurations. I even tried 3D printing some nylon carbon reinforced lift cups. That didn't really work in the rear. I looked at a few different options. Looked at Spacer.com out of Germany. They're a little bit expensive, but they had an interesting solution. Make a long story short, what I ended up going with was a 2-inch lift for the front. It bolts right up to the chassis between the upper strut mount, and it sort of bolts right in. And in the rear, I did end up going with Spacer.com out of Germany because the cups that I had used didn't seem to work. They were making some sort of a knocking noise, and so eventually just went with Spacer.com. But it's a very different solution. So universalcarlifts.com are what supplied the front, and they worked out really nicely for about $200 for a pair. They even come with a set of bolts for you. And then in the rear, Spacer.com, in fact, for a total of about 1.1 inches of a spacer, which translates to a little over 2 inches in the back. So I'll say that again. If you're after a 2-inch lift, in the front it's about 1-to-1, so you get a 2-inch spacer. But in the rear, a 1 to 1.1 inch spacer translates to a little over 2 inches in the rear. So we've got approximately the same lift on both sides. The stock configuration on the car, I said the ground clearance was around 6.1, 6.3 inches. If you have to get down to this angle, I'll show another shot, but it's about 8.5 inches now. And rides very nicely. Last thing I'll say about this is this car handles the lift very well. We'll show you in the instruction video, the geometry of the car is not compromised very much. Okay, let's talk about the roof basket a little bit. This is probably one of the more controversial aspects of the build. I think there's a few other options apart from putting a spare on the roof, although putting a spare on the roof is important, or at least getting a spare was important. So I went with a Thule Canyon XT roof basket. with an extra fairing that I put on it, helped with some of the wind noise. This is the Thule Evo wing bar, and I went with a rail system. This is a TP42 by Thule, and I think this works a little bit better, at least for what I was looking for. It's a little bit cleaner than using, for example, clamps that clamp onto the top. You can do that as well, and they can be removed, but I was a little bit hesitant to put the clamps on. I actually tried them. They worked fine, but I think this is a little bit cleaner look. The only problem with using, of course, the roof rail system is that you have to put rivets into the roof of the car, and that's a little bit scary, and probably the scariest thing I did to the vehicle. But it's actually really simple to drill the holes, and it comes with all the tools to clamp them down really nicely. So you can go either way, but this worked out well for me. I think the only disadvantage, I'd say, for the roof basket, of course, is that it does drop your range a little bit, probably about 15 miles in total. You know, somewhere in the order of around, you know, up to maybe even 10% of your range is lost because of the roof basket. It only really comes into play when you're going, you know, high speed, maybe over 60 miles an hour, maybe 70 miles an hour. That's when you really feel it. And of course, the other thing is they're noisy. Roof baskets are a little bit noisy. So at high speed, if that bothers you, you might want to consider putting the tire in the back, for example. But with the extra fairing and you know, the Canyon XT system has a little bit of a natural flair to it anyway. It's not too bad. It's tolerable. Certainly at speeds below 60 miles an hour, it's pretty silent. So let's talk a little bit about the tow bar, tow hitch. I got this from EcoHitch. It's fully stainless steel, and it's a very clean look. It goes, kind of bolts directly to the chassis underneath the bumper. Thanks to the IONIQ guy for spearheading that first effort and showing us how to do it. You do have to cut a little window out of the bottom of the bumper, very small piece, but you really can't see it. That's from Torcliffe Central, I believe, is the company that sells it. I did add a sort of recovery hook. This is not necessary, sort of adds to the look, but you know, it might come in handy at some point. Remember, the IONIQ 5 in the United States is rated at about 2,000 pound towing capacity. Ironically, in the UK and Australia, the same car has a towing capacity rating of 3,500 pounds. I have a feeling that it could probably handle the 3,500 pounds here in the United States as well. That's comparable to the Tesla Model Y. It's significantly less than you know, bigger vehicles, and for example, the Rivian is upwards of 7,500 pounds and more. But this will tow certainly a bike rack, a small boat, a smaller sized camper, and so I think this is an absolute requirement. Gives you lots of options. And we talked about the placement of the spare tire. Remember, putting it up on the roof is certainly an option, and it works well for me. But there's plenty of configurations where you can get a swing out or fold down rack to attach directly to the tow hitch to place your tire here. You're going to have to do something with the backup camera in that scenario, unless you don't need it or want it. I tend to appreciate the backup camera, but it won't beep at you. The LiDAR or whatever sensors these are for detecting distance or range should be well out of the way if you do place a tire up here. Overall, I'm very pleased with the IONIQ 5, and certainly the modifications that we made seem to have complemented the car very well. The IONIQ 5 has already won numerous accolades across the globe in its young existence, but with the lift, the sort of beefier tires and added spare and roof rack, I think we've taken a car that's very capable and brought it to another level. I fully endorse doing some modest changes, at least larger tires to some extent. You have to make a decision about whether or not it's worth going with the lift as well, but I think it complements the overall package very nicely. So overall, very pleased with the IONIQ 5, and good luck on your own adventures.